She just wanted to save the plot. She cut down an old tree that was leaking water, but the ground beneath her feet turned out to be alive. And when she split the trunk with an axe, something came out from under the roots that shouldn't have come out. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you're from. The summer had lingered too long in southern Alabama, clinging to the air like a fever that refused to break. The soil had cracked open weeks ago, hard as iron beneath Clara Witt's boots. Every morning, when she crossed the yard to check the fields, she could hear the brittle crunch of her own footsteps echoing in the silence that stretched over the land. Even the wind had stopped visiting. The crows were gone too, as if they had flown toward better places, where water still remembered how to rise. Clara was 47, though the sun had carved deeper years across her skin. Her hair, streaked with gray, was always pulled into a loose knot at the back of her neck. Her palms were rough and darkened from decades of work, from milking, planting, fixing, hammering, and from holding on too long to a life that refused to hold her back. She had been a farmer's wife, and now she was only the land's keeper. Her husband, Thomas, had died 3 years earlier, after a heart attack that came as suddenly as a thunderclap in dry skies. Her only son, Joel, lived in Birmingham, where the city hummed with cars and noise she no longer understood. He called on Sundays sometimes. His voice was kind, but hurried, as though life was chasing him and he was afraid to slow down long enough to be caught. Her home sat on a stretch of ground that had belonged to the Witt family for more than a century. A wooden house with faded paint, its boards creaking in the afternoon heat, its porch sagging like tired shoulders. The fields beyond it were a pale gold of dying corn and brittle weeds. But at the heart of the land stood a single living thing that still defied the drought, an enormous oak tree beside the old well. Its roots twisted deep into the earth like dark veins. Thomas used to say the tree was older than the family, that its shadow had once covered wagons and horses when the first Witts settled here after the war. Clara sometimes believed it remembered them all. Every evening, after the chores were done, she would sit on the porch with a glass of water and listen to the sounds that weren't there. The empty hum of cicadas that should have been singing, the silence of the fields that should have whispered with wind. The oak's branches barely moved. When the light faded, the house seemed to breathe around her, old wood shifting, sighing, waiting. It was during one of those evenings that she noticed something strange. Beneath the oak, where its roots pushed through the ground, the dirt looked darker. At first she thought it was a shadow, a trick of the sunset. But when she walked closer and knelt down, she saw that the soil was damp. She touched it. Cool moisture clung to her fingertips. It was impossible. There hadn't been rain in 6 weeks. She pressed her hand deeper, and a thin shimmer of water glinted in the last light. She stood up slowly, frowning toward the horizon, where the sky was still a flat, merciless blue. Maybe a burst pipe, she thought, though there were no pipes left running beneath the old yard. She wiped her hand on her jeans and told herself it meant nothing. Still, that night she dreamed of rain. In her sleep she heard it pattering against the roof, soft and steady, and when she woke, her cheeks were wet as if her own skin had mistaken the dream for truth. By morning, the damp spot had grown wider. The ground gleamed faintly in the sun. Clara fetched an empty bucket and set it by the roots, half amused at her own superstition. When she came back that evening, the bucket was half full of clear water. She lifted it, sniffed it, and took a sip. It tasted like stone cold, metallic, and clean. It slid down her throat like a memory from another season. She laughed aloud, the sound startling in the stillness. Maybe it was a gift, she thought. Maybe the earth hadn't forgotten her after all. She began to collect it every day, carrying jars and bowls to the oak, filling them as if she were tending a secret spring. She poured the water over the drooping flowers near the porch, and by the third morning, one of the lilies had lifted its pale head again. Hope came like a faint breeze through her chest. The neighbors noticed, too. Old Mr. Langston from the farm down the road came by and said, "Looks like your land's got a blessing on it, Miss Witt. Maybe God's sending you a message." She smiled politely, though she didn't believe God bothered much with messages anymore. But the tree began to change. Its leaves, once deep green, turned yellow at the edges. The bark, usually rough and gray, grew soft in patches where the water trickled out. The damp spot spread into a ring that reached halfway around the trunk. Clara crouched beside it one afternoon and felt the ground sink slightly under her palm. The soil was breathing, moving up and down with the faint rhythm of a hidden pulse. That night, she couldn't sleep. The air inside the house was too heavy, too still. She heard faint noises beneath the floorboards, a low, distant murmur, like the hum of an old machine buried underground. It came and went, steady as breathing. She told herself it was imagination, the kind that comes to a woman who spends too much time alone. Yet she left her bed and stood barefoot on the porch, staring toward the oak. The moonlight caught the sheen of water at its base. The sound was clearer outside, a slow, resonant throb deep within the earth. The next day, she opened an old notebook, the one she had used years ago to record rainfall and crop cycles. She began writing again. July 12th, she marked. Water still rising, colder than yesterday. Smells like iron, soil sinking slightly. Each entry was neat, careful. It gave her something to control. In the evenings, she sat on the porch, writing by lantern light, listening. The noise grew louder. She started dreaming more vividly. In one dream, she saw the oak standing alone in a sea of black water, its roots spreading down through layers of earth into darkness. Beneath the roots were figures men in miners' helmets, their faces blurred by silt. They were looking up at her through the water, and one raised his hand, as if asking to be heard. His mouth moved, forming words she couldn't understand. When she woke, her heart pounded, her sheets damp with sweat. The following morning she walked to the tree and found something shining near the roots. Kneeling down, she brushed away the mud and uncovered a small, rusted piece of metal, a tag or token, stamped with 2 letters. W.S. Her breath caught. Those were her great-grandfather's initials, William Samuel Witt. She'd seen them in the family Bible, etched in a curling script beside a date long before her time. How could something of his be here, buried under the roots of a living tree? She wiped the metal clean with her sleeve, but the letters remained faint and stubborn, like a whisper that refused to fade. She carried the token inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and sat staring at it as the light shifted through the window. She remembered her father telling her that the Witts had once worked in the mines, coal, iron, whatever the earth offered, and that the family land had been bought cheap after one of those mines collapsed. "Your great-granddaddy said the ground down there was cursed," he had said, half joking. "But it grows good corn." Clara had laughed then. Now she wasn't sure. The water continued to rise. It crept outward across the yard, forming a shallow pool that glimmered under the sun. When she stepped near it, the mud sucked gently at her boots. She noticed tiny bubbles surfacing from time to time, like air escaping from deep below. Her dog refused to cross that part of the yard. Even the chickens began to roost on the fence instead of the ground. By the 4th week, the sound beneath the soil was constant, a low, rhythmic tremor that seemed to travel up through the soles of her feet and into her bones. She felt it when she washed dishes, when she lay in bed, even when she prayed. It was not threatening exactly, but it made her uneasy. as if the land were trying to speak a language she almost understood. Then came the night of the storm that never happened. Clouds gathered, thunder rolled, but no rain fell. The lightning flashed far away, silent and hollow. She sat by the window, waiting, until she felt something shift in her chest, a strange certainty that the tree could not stand much longer. Its branches hung heavy, dripping with the endless flow from within. The ground around it gleamed like a mirror. At dawn, she made up her mind. She couldn't watch it die slowly. If the tree was sick, if the water was killing it, she would free it from suffering. That was what Thomas would have done. She fetched his old axe from the shed. The handle was worn smooth by his hands. It felt foreign in hers. She crossed the yard barefoot, the mud cool against her skin, and stood before the oak. For a long moment she simply watched it. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale gold over the bark. Drops of water slid down its trunk like tears. She whispered, "I'm sorry," and lifted the axe. The first swing landed with a hollow sound, deeper than wood. Water spurted from the wound, cold and bright against her arms. She gasped, but swung again. The second strike widened the cut, and this time, a stream burst forth, splashing across her legs. The ground trembled. The noise beneath the soil swelled to a roar. Clara stumbled back, dropping the axe. The water gushed faster, flooding over her boots. She turned toward the house, but something made her pause. The air had gone utterly still. Not a single leaf stirred. Even the insects were silent. It was as if the whole world was holding its breath. And then, somewhere deep below, the earth exhaled. The sound that followed was not quite thunder, not quite wind. It was heavier, older, like a sigh that had waited a century to escape. The water around the oak shimmered, rippling outward in perfect circles. Clara stood motionless, her heart hammering. She felt, rather than heard, a voice rising from the depths, a voice without words, only weight. It vibrated through her bones, through the house, through the land itself. She backed away slowly, her breath shallow, eyes fixed on the place where the roots disappeared into the churning soil. The oak swayed, its leaves shivering. For the first time in weeks, the wind moved, but it came from below, not above. It was cold and damp, smelling of stone and memory. Clara turned and ran toward the porch, the bucket forgotten, the axe half buried in mud. Behind her, the ground glistened under the new light of morning, alive and restless. By the time she reached the door, she knew that nothing on her land would ever be still again. By morning, the world outside Clara's window no longer resembled the quiet land she had known all her life. The yard had become a shallow marsh. The once hard soil turned to a slick, trembling skin of mud. The oak tree stood wounded and glistening in the gray dawn, its bark soaked and shining like the back of some creature just risen from the depths. Water poured from the gash she had made, steady and unending, cutting a small channel that twisted through the yard toward the dying cornfield. She could hear it even from inside the kitchen, a constant hiss, the sound of something alive and restless. Clara stood barefoot in the doorway, her old flannel shirt clinging to her arms. The air was heavy with a mineral smell that clung to her throat and reminded her of rusted tools and river stones. When she stepped into the mud, the cold shot up her legs. She tried to think of practical things, like where the water might be coming from, or whether it would ruin the well. But all she could feel was that the land had changed overnight, as if she had opened a door that was never meant to be opened. By midday, her yard looked like the edge of a pond. The chickens refused to leave their roosts, and the dog whined under the porch, tail tucked tight. Clara filled a bucket and tried to pour the water back into the well, as though the earth might take it back, but it only seeped out again, darker than before. She thought of calling her son, but what would she say? That the ground was bleeding? That she had struck at a tree and found a river underneath? Instead, she called her neighbor, Mr. Langston, who came by in his pickup and stood staring at the flowing water with his cap in his hands. "That's no blessing anymore," he muttered. "You ought to get someone from the county to look at this." He drove away soon after, his tires throwing clumps of wet clay behind him. By sunset, a man from the county arrived with a clipboard and a tired smile. He introduced himself as Martin Dorsey, a hydrologist, and said he'd seen things like this before. Old wells collapsing, underground pressure breaking through a weak spot. He crouched by the oak, measured the flow with a small device, then straightened up and said, "Nothing to worry about. Probably an old water vein. Lucky in a drought like this." His words meant nothing to her. He didn't look at the way the tree leaned, didn't notice the strange vibration that ran through the ground when he touched the trunk. He left her with a half-hearted warning about slippery soil and promised to file a report. That night, the noise under the house grew louder. Clara could feel it through the floorboards, a faint rhythmic pulse that seemed to travel upward, humming in her bones. The windows rattled in their frames. Once or twice, she thought she heard a knock from beneath the floor, soft and deliberate, as though someone trapped below were trying to signal her. When she stepped outside to listen, the sound stopped. Unable to sleep, she lit the old oil lamp and began searching through the wooden chest in her bedroom, the one that had belonged to her father. Inside were letters, old deeds, and yellowed photographs of men standing beside mining shafts. She hadn't opened it in years. The air inside smelled of dust and iron. Among the papers, she found a folded newspaper clipping dated 1911. The headline read, "Mine sealed after collapse at Witt Hollow." Her eyes caught on the name. Witt. The article spoke of a coal shaft flooded intentionally after a series of explosions trapped 36 miners inside. The final paragraph listed the supervisor responsible for authorizing the flooding, William S. Witt, her great-grandfather. She sat down hard on the bed. The lamp flickered, throwing shadows against the wall. She unfolded another paper from the same bundle of letter in faded ink. The handwriting was her grandfather's. "We saved the town," it said, "but not the men. Father told us the earth would hold their silence. He said we must never dig there again. The land will take care of its own." Clara's mouth went dry. She imagined the miners below, their lamps burning out one by one, the earth filling around them as the tunnels flooded. She wondered if their bones still lay beneath her feet, sealed in darkness, their breath trapped in stone. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, scattering loose leaves across the porch. The lamp wavered, and a drop of water fell from the ceiling onto her wrist. She looked up. The roof boards were damp. The air in the house felt heavier now, as if the water were seeping not just from the ground, but through the very walls. The next morning, the county sent more men. 2 geologists and a woman named Dr. Emma Reeves, whose calm, intelligent gaze reminded Clara of a schoolteacher she once feared and admired in equal measure. They brought strange machines with blinking lights and metal rods that they sank into the ground. Emma explained that there was likely an underground aquifer, a pressurized pocket of water that had been sealed by rock or clay. Sometimes, she said, they find their own way out. Clara watched them work, her arms folded tightly. The instruments beeped and chirped while the men murmured technical phrases she didn't understand. Emma finally showed her the monitor on a small tablet screen. The image was a map of shadows and pale shapes, an empty cavity beneath her property, large as a church nave, with one thin corridor snaking toward the north. "There was a mine here once, wasn't there?" Emma asked gently. Clara nodded, unable to speak. When they packed up to leave, Emma lingered behind. "We'll need to drill a pressure shaft," she said. "If we don't relieve the buildup, the ground could collapse." "Drill?" Clara repeated. The thought of men tearing into the soil again filled her with dread. "You'll make it worse." Emma's expression softened, but her tone was firm. "If we don't, the land might give way on its own. You don't want that to happen, do you?" Clara said nothing. She only looked toward the oak, whose branches hung limp and glistening. The steady gush of water had turned the yard into a mirror, reflecting the pale sky. That evening, she sat on the porch and listened to the machines as the crew began setting up near the edge of the property. The sound of engines and metal against metal grated through the still air. Every vibration seemed to echo from below. She thought of her father's voice telling stories of the mines, the darkness, the gas, the men who sang to keep fear away. She remembered how he said the earth could swallow a man without warning. And she remembered something else. The look in his eyes when he said the land never forgot. When the drilling started, the air changed. The first strike of the bit against the ground sent a quiver through the earth that ran all the way to the house. The water near the oak frothed and hissed. The sound beneath her feet deepened, turning from a hum to a low, rolling growl. Clara clutched the porch railing. The men didn't stop. They shouted over the roar of their machines. One of them laughed. To them, it was just rock and pressure and water. But to Clara, it was something else. The land felt alive, reacting to the intrusion. She could feel it, an agitation, a warning. The dog began to howl. Birds erupted from the trees in a wild spiral. Emma waved for the drilling to pause, but before they could, a deep crack split the air, followed by a rush of hot wind that smelled of sulfur and iron. The machines jerked violently, and water sprayed upward in a column. The men scrambled back, shouting. Clara ran to the fence and saw the mud boiling like a pot left too long on the stove. The stream that had once trickled gently now churned with force, sending waves across the yard. A noise like distant thunder rolled from below, but it didn't fade. It grew, a steady, pulsing beat that seemed to rise from the center of the earth. "Shut it down!" Emma yelled, and the engines died. But the sound did not. It was deeper than machinery, more ancient. The water darkened to the color of smoke. The ground under Clara's feet vibrated until her knees shook. She felt as though she were standing on a living thing, breathing and angry. As night fell, the workers left, promising to return with more equipment. Clara refused to leave the house. She lit every lamp and watched the yard from the window. The oak stood at the center of the flood, half submerged, its reflection shivering in the moonlight. From time to time, bubbles broke the surface around its roots, releasing bursts of steam. Sometime after midnight, she heard footsteps, not on the porch, but beneath it. Slow, heavy steps that dragged slightly, as though through mud. She froze, her heart hammering. The sound moved under the floor, crossed the kitchen, and faded toward the well. Then silence. She pressed her hand against the wall and whispered, "Who's there?" But only the sound of dripping answered her. The dog whimpered. Near dawn, the air grew warmer, thick with mist. Clara stepped outside. The fog curled low to the ground, clinging to her ankles. When she reached the edge of the flooded yard, she saw something moving beneath the water, a glint of metal, the curve of an old helmet, or maybe just a trick of the light. The bubbling grew louder, and for an instant, she thought she saw a shape, a hand, reaching upward from the darkness below. She stumbled back, her breath sharp in her throat. The vision dissolved, leaving only ripples and mud. By the time the sun rose, she no longer questioned what she saw. The land was remembering. It was speaking in the only voice it had. The next day, reporters came, men with cameras and bright smiles, who called the place a mystery spring. They asked her to stand beside the oak for photographs, but she refused. She told them the land wasn't safe. They laughed, said she was lucky to have a spectacle. Emma returned with them, her eyes tired. She pulled Clara aside and whispered, "The pressure is increasing. We'll need to open another vent. If we don't, this whole area could sink." "Let it," Clara said. "Maybe that's what it wants." Emma looked at her, uncertain whether to argue. "You don't understand," she said. "This isn't alive. It's geology." Clara smiled faintly. "Geology doesn't breathe." That night, the wind came back, but it blew upward from the ground. It rattled the windows and sent shivers through the boards of the house. The sound beneath the earth rose and fell like the tide. Clara stood on the porch, her lantern flickering, and felt the vibration pass through her chest like a heartbeat, not her own. Sometime after midnight, a deep rumble began, the air filled with the smell of rain and metal. Then came the first collapse. A section of the field caved in, swallowed whole by the mud. The water surged toward the gap, hissing as it disappeared underground. Clara ran to the oak, shouting into the wind. She felt the earth shaking beneath her, the tremor of something vast turning in its sleep. She reached the tree and laid her hand against its trunk. The bark was cold, slick, pulsing faintly under her palm. "I'm listening," she whispered. "I'm here." The ground shuddered again, and a roar burst upward from the depths, not like thunder now, but like breath, a single colossal exhale. The wind threw her backward. The last thing she saw before falling was the oak, its roots lifting, the water rising around it like hands pulling it down. When she opened her eyes, the sky was flashing white with lightning. The rain had finally come, but it wasn't falling from the clouds. It was rising from the earth itself, thick vapor curling into the storm. Clara dragged herself to her knees, staring into the churning pit that had once been her yard. Beneath the sound of the wind and the rushing water, she could hear it clearly now. A deep, mournful voice without words, a voice that seemed to come from every direction at once. It spoke through the ground, through the air, through the pounding in her chest. She didn't run. She couldn't. She stood trembling on the edge of the collapse and whispered into the storm, "I hear you. I hear you." The voice answered with another long breath that rolled across the land, shaking the trees to their roots. The ground opened wider. The house groaned. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The night fell silent except for the hiss of water filling the hollow where her world had once stood. When the first pale light of dawn spread across the horizon, Clara stood alone in the aftermath. The oak was gone. The field had vanished beneath a smooth, rippling surface that reflected the sky like a mirror. Steam drifted from the water, carrying with it the faint, sweet smell of iron. She looked down into the new lake, its edges raw and fresh, and for the first time understood that what had awakened beneath her home was not anger, but release. The earth had been holding its breath for a century, and she had simply given it permission to breathe again. She turned toward the ruined house, its roof sagging, the porch half collapsed. Behind her, the lake gurgled softly, whispering through the reeds. She didn't cry. She only whispered, "You've spoken now. You can rest." And somewhere beneath the still surface, far below where light could reach, the earth seemed finally to sigh in peace. When morning finally broke, it came quietly, without the song of birds or the hum of crickets. The air was heavy, as though the world itself had forgotten how to move. Clara stood at the edge of what had once been her yard, her boots sinking into the soft, trembling soil. Before her stretched the new lake round, wide and strangely still, its surface unbroken except for faint curls of mist rising in the sunlight. The water was the color of iron and smoke, reflecting a sky that had turned pale and fragile after the storm. The oak was gone. So was the house she had built her life around. Half of the roof had been swallowed by the earth, the rest listing against a skeleton of collapsed walls. The chicken coop had vanished completely. Only the mailbox, crooked and dented, still stood at the edge of the dirt road, as if pretending that this was still a place where letters could arrive. Clara's breath fogged faintly in the cool morning air. She was trembling, not from cold, but from a feeling she couldn't name. Fear, awe, guilt, and something like reverence mingled together until they became indistinguishable. The land she had known all her life had changed shape in a single night, as though it had exhaled her past and replaced it with silence. She felt smaller than she ever had before, a trespasser in a story that had begun long before her birth. The road was blocked by mudslides, and it took the county 3 days to reach her. By then, the story had spread. People came in trucks, standing on the edges of the new lake, whispering in disbelief. Some called it a natural disaster. Others called it a miracle. Reporters arrived, their voices too loud for the quiet place that had once been her home. They filmed the shining surface of the water and called it Whit Hollow Lake, a name that would appear in newspapers by nightfall. Clara said nothing when they asked for her thoughts. She refused every interview, her eyes fixed on the water. The officials told her she would have to leave. "It's not safe here," one of them said, a young man with a clipboard and mud on his boots. "Ground like this keeps shifting for weeks after a collapse. You can't stay." She nodded without answering. That evening, she packed a few clothes and photographs into an old duffel bag and walked down the road until she reached a neighbor's house. For a while, she stayed with them, sleeping on their sofa, listening to the faraway hum of trucks and generators as the county surveyed the area. But she couldn't rest. The house felt borrowed, like a coat that didn't fit. Every night she dreamed of the water and of voices rising from it, faint and rhythmic, like the breath of men singing underground. After a week, she rented a small trailer in the next county, near a grove of pines. It was modest but solid, the kind of place where no one asked questions. She kept the curtains drawn and the television off. The silence of the forest reminded her of her old land before the noise began. The dry fields, the windless sky. She thought that maybe she could live here quietly, start over, as people always said one could. But the past had a way of finding her. The newspapers called Whit Hollow Lake a geological wonder. Scientists arrived from universities, taking samples and photographs. They found remnants of wood and rusted iron deep below the surface support beams, they said, from the old mine that had been sealed a century earlier. They speculated about underground rivers and sinkholes, about shifting limestone and water tables. No one spoke of the 36 miners who had never been recovered. No one mentioned her great-grandfather's name. But when she saw the news broadcast, showing the glint of those metal fragments under the murky water, her stomach turned. She turned off the screen and sat for a long time in the dark. Sometimes, when she drove into town for groceries, she heard people talking about it at the diner or gas station. "Whole house went down like it was never there," a man said once. Guess she was living on borrowed time. Others called it a curse, though they said it with amusement, not belief. Clara walked past them without a word. In her mind, she could still hear the voice of the earth, the long, heavy exhale that had followed the storm. It wasn't a curse, she thought. It was the land remembering what people had done to it. As autumn came, the world around her began to settle. The nights were cooler, the days softer. Yet inside her there was a restlessness, an ache she couldn't name. She tried to visit the lake only once, but the moment she stepped onto the dirt road leading to it, her body froze. The air there felt different, charged, alive, humming faintly beneath the surface. She stood there for a long while, staring at the expanse of water that had swallowed her home. The surface rippled gently, and for a moment, she thought she saw shapes moving beneath it. Slow, shifting shadows that might have been fish or something older, heavier. She turned back before she could find out. Still, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Every night, before sleep claimed her, she imagined the water spreading beneath the hills, filling the caverns where the miners had once worked. She imagined their lanterns flickering in the dark, their voices rising in an endless chorus. Perhaps they weren't angry at all. Perhaps they were only relieved to be remembered. One morning in late November, Clara returned. She didn't plan it. She woke before dawn, dressed in her old jeans and boots, and drove without thinking until she reached the road where the mailbox still stood, crooked and leaning. The mist was thick, curling through the hollows like breath. She parked by the edge and walked the rest of the way, her steps sinking into the soft earth. The air smelled of wet stone and pine. The lake was larger than before. The county had fenced it off, but the water had risen beyond the barrier, glimmering through the fog like a sheet of glass. The silence was immense, so deep it seemed to press against her ears. Clara stood there, feeling the damp air cling to her skin. She didn't cry. The tears had already been spent long ago, when the land still had a heartbeat she could feel. She knelt down and touched the ground, which was soft and cool, pulsing faintly beneath her fingertips. It felt alive still, but calm, as though it had finally found rest. Something glinted nearby. She brushed aside a layer of mud and found a small green shoot pushing through the soil. A seedling, tender and bright. No taller than her hand. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart tightening. It was a young oak, unmistakably. She dug carefully around it, loosening the earth, and lifted it out with both hands. Its roots were wet but strong. She carried it back to the truck and wrapped it gently in a rag. At home, she planted it beside the trailer, in a patch of grass that caught the morning light. Each day she watered it with care, using a tin can instead of a hose. She spoke to it sometimes, quietly, the way she used to talk to the old oak in her yard. She told it things she could tell no one else. That she was sorry, that she understood now how the earth kept its secrets, and that she hoped the water under Whit Hollow was finally still. Winter passed into spring. The little oak grew steadily, its leaves unfolding one by one. Sometimes, when the wind passed through the pines, she imagined it was whispering in the same voice she had heard beneath her land, the voice that had once shaken the house and filled the night with its breath. But now it spoke softly, peacefully. In May, a young reporter found her. He was polite, nervous, carrying a notepad and a camera. "Ms. Whit," he said, "the people in town said you used to live on the lake property. I'm writing a follow-up piece about the collapse. Could I ask a few questions?" Clara hesitated. "There's nothing more to tell," she said. "Just one thing," he insisted gently. "If you'd known what was beneath the ground that day, would you still have cut down the tree?" She looked past him at the small oak swaying in the breeze. The sunlight caught the new leaves, turning them gold at the edges. "No," she said after a moment. "But maybe the tree chose for me. Sometimes the earth knows when it's time to speak, even if we don't want to hear it." He scribbled her words down, though she doubted he understood them. When he left, she walked to the oak and touched its trunk. It was growing strong, its bark rougher now beneath her palm. A faint rustle came from its branches, the sound so familiar that it made her chest ache. That night, she dreamed of the old tree again, the one that had stood guard over her family for generations. But in the dream, it wasn't dying. It was standing tall on the shore of the lake, its branches stretching wide, its roots sinking into the water below. The moon shone through its leaves, and beneath the surface of the lake, faint shapes drifted like shadows of memory. They weren't frightening anymore. They seemed to belong there, part of the rhythm of the land. When she woke, the dawn was pale and quiet. She made coffee, stepped outside, and watched the mist lift from the pines. The young oak shimmered with dew, each droplet catching the early light. She sat beside it, her hand resting on the cool earth, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. She no longer needed to understand everything that had happened. The questions, the water, the miners, her great-grandfather's guilt had all become part of the same story, and the story belonged to the land. It had breathed, spoken, and finally fallen silent. She was only its witness, the last keeper of a secret older than her family name. By summer, the lake became a tourist spot. People came with boats and cameras, laughing as they floated over the place where her house had once stood. The county built a small dock and a sign describing the event in simple, sterile words. Whit Hollow Lake, formed after a rare geological collapse in 2025. There was no mention of the miners, or the oak, or the woman who had lived there. But Clara didn't mind. The truth didn't need to be written. It only needed to be remembered. Sometimes at dusk, she drove to the lake again. She would park near the fence and watch the water darken to the color of ink. The air there was cool, filled with the smell of wet earth. When the wind blew across the surface, it made a sound like breathing. Slow, deep, and steady. She would close her eyes and listen. "You're quiet now," she would whisper. "That's good. You've said what you needed to say." The breeze would rise gently, lifting her hair, and in that soft movement she could almost hear an answer. Not words, just the faintest sigh, the kind that carries both sorrow and relief. Back at her trailer, the young oak waited. Each year, its shadow grew longer, stretching across the grass toward her door. Sometimes, she thought of planting another beside it, so it wouldn't stand alone. But then she would smile and shake her head. The earth, she had learned, always decided for itself. One evening in late summer, as the sun sank low, she walked out barefoot to the oak and stood beside it. The leaves rustled in a slow rhythm, and she laid her hand against the trunk. Beneath the rough bark, she felt a pulse. Not the tremor of the earth this time, but something gentler, steadier. The air smelled of soil and rain. She closed her eyes and said softly, "You can rest now. So can I." The wind moved through the branches one last time, whispering through the leaves like a lullaby. The light faded, the world dimmed, and in the deep quiet that followed, Clara Whit finally felt the same peace that had settled over the land, a silence not of loss, but of understanding. The earth no longer breathed in pain. It breathed in calm. And somewhere beneath it, in the cool darkness where voices once called out, the past was finally still. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next one, and share this video with someone who still believes that every place holds a secret.